Welcome back to the Fulker Lab podcast, where we talk intelligence, strategy, leadership, and the lost art of discernment. If you've been with us from the start, you know the origin story. In episode 1, we talked about an experiment I ran where we gave some analysts a simple structured method, hypothesis testing, and let others do business as usual. The structured folks beat the gut feel folks. In episode 2, we invited AI and large language models into the shop and asked whether they would help us think better or just help us be wrong faster with nicer sentences. Today, in episode 3, we're going after the engine behind all of that, critical thinking for intelligence analysts. This isn't a PME lecture. We're going to keep it close to your day job and have a little fun at our own expense along the way. A lot of what I'm going to walk through is based on an article I wrote with my good friend and co-author, Jay Fudemberg, for the Air and Space Power Journal called Empowering the Information Warrior, Unlocking the Latent Value of This Strategic Asset. Jay did the heavy intellectual lifting on that paper. I mostly tried to make sure Intel folks would still talk to us after they read it. Let's start with a slightly uncomfortable question. If you're an Intel analyst, how confident are you in your critical thinking? Most of us, if we're honest, would say something like, I'm pretty good. We got through training, we're cleared, and we can survive a joint staff meeting without crying. Surely, we're at least above average. The problem is, the data says otherwise. The Educational Testing Service found that only about 6% of college graduates are actually proficient in critical thinking. The American Association of Colleges and Universities says 75% of employers think recent grads are weak in critical thinking and problem solving. That's the same talent pool feeding your skiff. Colonel Adam Mez Stone decided to test whether Air Force was any better. He tested 180 Air Force officers. When he compared them with a graduate degree norm group, the Air Force group scored below average. Later, he did a similar study with students at Air Command and Staff College, Air War College, and the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. The results were equally disappointing. Stone essentially said, we talk a big game about critical thinking, but we're not actually producing it at scale. So if you've ever been in a VTC and thought, we might not be quite as analytical as we think we are, congratulations. You're not being critical, you're being observant. Before we fix anything, we should be clear on what we're trying to fix. Jay liked a very straightforward definition. Critical thinking is reasonable, reflective thinking focused on deciding what to believe or what to do. It's not just being negative or poking holes in someone else's slide. It's about understanding your own thinking, which produces better analysis. In our article, we broke higher order thinking down into a set of skills intelligence analysts actually use. Think about what you do on a good day. You look at a situation, say a crisis in a country, and you can see more than the last 3 spot reports. You understand the broader context, the players, and what's changing, what's stable. You don't just parrot the last INSUM, you're holding a mental picture of the whole thing. You're able to frame and reframe the problem. Maybe the tasker says, assess whether they will attack. But you realize the better question is, under what conditions would an attack be rational for them? How close are we to that world? So you quietly adjust the frame and answer the question they should have asked. You spot patterns. You see that this exercise looks a lot like their last pre-deployment posture. But you also notice the key differences, not just the similarities. You notice what you don't know. You're aware there are gaps and ambiguities, and you don't paper over them with vague language. You can say, here's what's solid, here's informed speculation, and here's where we're basically guessing. You surface assumptions, big ones like, this regime values survival above all, or they won't risk a direct clash with us. And you ask, what if that's wrong? You don't wait until the post-mortem to discover the sacred cow. You weigh evidence and probabilities. Rather than treating every report as equal, you know which sources are historically reliable, which ones are noisy, and you adjust how much weight they get in your mind. And you can pull all of that into a clear, fact-based argument for your assessment instead of just stacking a bunch of supporting bullets and naming it analytic judgment. That bundle of skills is what we mean by higher order thinking. Critical thinking is what happens when you deliberately bring those skills to bear to decide what's true enough to brief and what's wise enough to recommend. Right now, in a lot of places, we just sort of hope that will happen because we hired some smart people and gave them SIPR and JWIX terminals. Jay and I thought we needed something better than hope. In the article, we argue that there are three main reasons analysts underperform on this front, and none of them boil down to try harder. First, most people simply don't leave school with these skills fully developed. Our education system is very good at having you memorize, test, and forget. It is much less consistent about teaching you how to structure messy, real-world problems. Second, once you arrive in the intel world, we talk a lot about critical thinking, but we rarely train and measure it in a serious, sustained way. You might get a week on analytic tradecraft at some point, maybe an article to read, and then it's back to please clear your taskers. Third, the day-to-day workflow of analysis actively pushes against higher order thinking. The system rewards speed. Answer chat, push the update, finish the product. Deep thinking takes time, and time is exactly what no one feels they have. There's usually nothing built into the production process that forces you to slow down and actually lay out your reasoning. Even if you're the rare person who aces a test like Watson Glaser, nothing about the way your watch floor is run guarantees you'll use those skills when the J3 is hovering and asking, "So what's your bottom line?" Knowing how to think and having a process that makes you think are two different things. So the problem isn't just we need smarter people. It's we need smarter people and a smarter way of doing the work. This is where Jay really dug in. He went through decades of research on how people learn and pulled out some simple insights that matter for analysts. You get better at thinking by actually doing the thinking on real problems, not by listening to somebody like me talk about thinking. You have to wrestle with the situation yourself, try to make sense of it, and then get good feedback on where your mental model works and where it doesn't. That struggle plus guidance combo is powerful. You also need something called metacognition, which is a fancy way of saying you noticed your own thinking. You can look at your draft and say, I'm rock solid on this part. I'm leaning heavily on assumptions over here. And this paragraph is me just bluffing with confidence. Training and tools can nudge you to do that. It doesn't show up just because someone hung critical thinking on the wall. Time matters. You don't build analytic muscle with a single PME block. Just like in the gym, you need reps, many cases over time, with feedback and chances to adjust. Motivation counts too. Analysts will work harder on problems that feel like their actual job. If the scenario looks like a real crisis you might encounter one day, you lean in. If it looks like a standardized test about Martian politics, you coast. And you need variety. If you only ever practice critical thinking on one region, you become an expert on that region. If you practice the underlying skills across different contexts, you become better at thinking, period. So Jay's big message was, you need training that deliberately exercises these skills and a way of building them into everyday Intel work, not just into classrooms. What does that look like in an Intel shop, not in a journal article? Here's the idea we came to. When you build an assessment, you don't just produce the prose. You also capture the elements of your thinking that usually stay invisible. You write down what you observed in the reporting, and separately, how you're interpreting those observations. You jot down the key assumptions you're leaning on. You spell out the inferences you're making, how you're moving from what you saw to what you think it means. You note how confident you are and why. You identify at least one reasonable alternative explanation and what evidence would make you favor it instead. And you sketch out the entire reasoning chain that gets you from point A to point Z. Now, you haven't just produced a product, you've produced an X-ray of your thinking. When your supervisor reviews the work, they can say more than tighten this sentence or add a map. They can say, this assumption doesn't hold, or you're treating this single report like it's gospel, or you've ignored this competing hypothesis that the commander is going to ask about. The feedback is about your thinking, not just your formatting. Your peers can do the same. A cyber analyst might look at your regional assessment and say, from where I sit, that assumption and their capabilities isn't accurate. A junior analyst might point out a piece of reporting that undermines a step in your reasoning that you missed. Because the reasoning is laid out, they don't need to guess what's happening in your head. When new information comes in, you're not rewriting the entire product from scratch. You're updating parts of the reasoning chain and seeing how it changes the conclusion. You can even go back months later and ask, okay, given how this actually played out, where did our thinking go right and where did it go wrong? If this is giving you flashbacks to episode 1's structured methods and episode 2's AI, that's not an accident. The same structure that makes it easier to think critically also makes it easier to apply formal techniques and to plug AI into the workflow without letting it quietly take over your judgment. So, where are we on this journey? Episode 1 showed that structure can help analysts beat pure intuition when the stakes are high and the problems are messy. Episode 2 warned that AI and large language models can either help you read and synthesize more than you ever could on your own, or help you be wrong at scale. Which way it goes depends on your tradecraft. This episode, drawing heavily on Jay Fudemberg's work, makes the case that critical thinking is the core human skill that makes both structure and AI worth having. If your critical thinking is weak, structured methods become theater. You go through the motions so you can say you did them. And AI becomes a very shiny shortcut you're tempted to trust because it sounds confident. If your critical thinking is strong, structure becomes a framework that focuses your judgment, and AI becomes a tool you interrogate, not a voice you obey. For you as an analyst, the practical question is, how can you make your thinking just a little more visible and deliberate this week? Maybe on your next product, you write your top 3 assumptions at the top of your notes and show them to a teammate. Maybe you force yourself to come up with one plausible alternative explanation before you brief the boss and say it out loud instead of hiding it in the footnotes. Small moves, often repeated, will change how you think. And because, apparently, we're all in on this thinking thing, episode 4 is going to get even more tactical. We're going to talk about everyday critical thinking habits you can build into your workflow. Quick questions to ask yourself before you hit send. Simple ways to catch your own bias, and how to disagree in the skiff without starting a small civil war. Critical thinking, now with the practical tools and only slightly more sarcasm. I can see the podcast stats plummeting. Hey, thanks for listening to the Fulcrum Lab podcast today. If this episode made you even a little more suspicious of your own first take, share it with another analyst, and then ask them, okay, what assumptions are you hiding in that slide?